Wait Until Dark stands as one of cinema's most intense psychological thrillers, a masterclass in suspense that still makes audiences hold their breath decades later. But what if we told you that the terror you see on screen was mirrored by very real fear behind the camera? That Audrey Hepburn's luminous performance came at a cost most fans never realized, and that a single creative decision almost destroyed the film's most iconic moment? What secrets hide in the shadows of this thriller about a woman trapped in darkness, fighting for her survival against a sadistic killer? Let's pull back the curtain on the production that pushed its star to the breaking point, the on-set accidents that became part of the film's legend, and the micro-details hidden in plain sight that transform everything you thought you understood about those final breathless minutes. This is the story behind the scream, the detail that changes how you see it. The architecture of terror. Wait Until Dark isn't just a thriller. It's a treatise on vulnerability, a film that weaponizes our most primal fear, helplessness in the face of predatory evil. The premise sounds almost impossibly simple. A recently blinded woman, alone in her basement apartment, must outwit 3 criminals searching for a heroin-stuffed doll. But beneath that high-concept hook lies something far more sophisticated. Psychological chess match, where every piece of furniture becomes a potential weapon or obstacle, where light itself becomes the ultimate advantage. Director Terrence Young understood that true suspense isn't about what you show, it's about what you withhold. The film forces audiences to experience the world through Susie Hendrix's compromised senses, to feel the geometry of her apartment as she does, by touch, by memory, by sound. Young and cinematographer Charles Lang crafted a visual language that literalizes blindness, using darkness not as atmosphere, but as narrative architecture. The film again, and you'll notice how often the camera abandons Susie's perspective to show us the threat she cannot see, creating a double layer of dread. We know what's coming. She doesn't. That gap becomes unbearable. The film would reveal 3 interlocking truths. First, Audrey Hepburn's decision to play Susie Hendrix represented a radical departure from her established persona, one that demanded she unlearn everything that had made her a star. Second, the production's technical innovations in lighting and sound design would quietly revolutionize how Hollywood depicted disability and suspense. Third, the film's climactic sequence, now legendary for its jump scare, survived by the thinnest of margins, nearly destroyed by a studio executive who thought he knew better. But here's what most people miss. The terror you witness on screen wasn't entirely performance. What happened during those final weeks of shooting would haunt the cast and crew for years. 1967, the year everything shifted. Wait Until Dark arrived in October 1967, landing in a Hollywood caught between old glamour and new grit. The production code was crumbling. Bonnie and Clyde had just shocked audiences with its bloody realism. The Graduate was about to rewrite what a leading man could be. Against this backdrop of revolution, here came a film that looked, at first glance, throwback. A stage adaptation starring the most elegant actress in the world. 1967 was also the year Audrey Hepburn needed something to prove. She hadn't had a significant hit since Charade 4 years earlier. Her marriage to Mel Ferrer was dissolving. Hollywood was becoming obsessed with youth, with counterculture, with a rawness that seemed antithetical to everything Hepburn represented. She was 38 years old, fighting the industry's cruel clock, and she knew it. Terrence Young, fresh from helding 3 James Bond films, brought a different kind of pedigree. He understood spectacle, yes, but also control. How to? Manipulate an audience's nervous system through pacing and withholding. Warner Brothers gave him a modest budget, barely $2 million, and a tight shooting schedule. The studio saw Wait Until Dark as a mid-tier thriller, an Audrey Hepburn vehicle that might turn a profit. No one predicted they were making a film that would still terrify viewers 50 years later. The source material came from Frederick Knott, who had written Dial M for Murder, another stage-bound thriller that Hitchcock had transformed into cinema. The play had been a Broadway hit, with Lee Remick originating the role of Susie. But Hepburn would have to make the part her own, to find something raw and desperate that audiences had never seen from her before. She would have to become, in essence, a different actress. Now here's where it gets complicated. Third, the porcelain image shatters. Audrey Hepburn built her career on an impossible paradox. She was approachable royalty, the princess you might actually meet. From Roman Holiday to Breakfast at Tiffany's to My Fair Lady, she embodied a specific fantasy: elegance without coldness, vulnerability without weakness, beauty that seemed accidental rather than calculated. Audiences didn't just admire her, they wanted to protect her. Wait Until Dark would require her to shatter that porcelain image completely. Susie Hendricks isn't graceful. She's clumsy, still learning to navigate her apartment without sight. She's scared, genuinely terrified, reduced to animal survival in the film's final act. She sweats, she crawls, she screams. These weren't things Audrey Hepburn did on screen. To prepare, Hepburn spent weeks at the Lighthouse for the Blind in New York, training with recently blinded adults. Learned to move through space with hesitant fingers, to cook breakfast without seeing the stove, to navigate doorways by counting steps. The instructors gave her weighted contact lenses that restricted her vision to vague shapes and shadows. Hepburn wore them for hours at a time, forcing herself to experience what Susie would experience. But the psychological preparation went deeper. Hepburn had to access real fear, real panic. Method techniques weren't her usual approach. She was trained in ballet, in hitting marks and controlling her instrument with precision. Now she needed to lose control. Terrence Young pushed her toward rawness, toward moments where the performance felt almost documentary. In scenes where Susie realizes she's being hunted, you can see genuine terror flash across Hepburn's face, something unfiltered and almost uncomfortable to watch. The cost? Hepburn would later describe Wait Until Dark as one of the most emotionally exhausting experiences of her career. Playing blindness wasn't just a technical challenge. It required her to inhabit genuine helplessness for weeks on end, to exist in a state of manufactured vulnerability that began to bleed into her actual psychology. She was playing a woman trapped in darkness, while her own life felt increasingly uncertain. That kind of immersion leaves marks. The basement that became a prison. Film's entire third act takes place in Susie's basement apartment, a space that becomes both cage and battlefield. But the decision to confine the action to one primary location wasn't just about honoring the stage origins. It was a calculated creative gambit that would define everything about how the film worked, and how its production nearly broke everyone involved. Her brothers built the apartment set on a soundstage in Burbank, California. Production designer George Jenkins created a space that felt simultaneously cramped and surprisingly large, full of visual information. Every element mattered. The refrigerator that Susie uses to hide the doll, the windows looking onto a street she can't see, the bedroom door that becomes a crucial barrier. Jenkins studied the geography obsessively, ensuring that Susie's movements would track consistently, that audiences could map the space as she learned to map it. But here's the part most people miss. That single location decision meant Hepburn had to work in that claustrophobic set for nearly 8 weeks straight. No exteriors, no location shooting. It's that apartment, day after day, playing terror in the same cramped rooms. The psychological weight of that confinement began to mirror Susie's own entrapment. Hepburn started experiencing panic attacks between takes, a sense that the walls were actually closing in. Terrence Young recognized this and used it. In the film's most intense sequences, you're watching Hepburn process genuine claustrophobia, real fear bleeding through the performance. When Susie realizes she's locked in with her potential killer, when she starts frantically smashing light bulbs to level the playing field, Hepburn's panic is barely theatrical. She's drawing from something real, something the production itself created in her. The apartment became a method acting tool none of them had planned for. When performance became survival, production's physical demands escalated as filming progressed. In the film's final sequence, the famous dark fight between Susie and Rote, both Hepburn and Alan Arkin, playing the sadistic criminal, had to perform in near-total darkness, their moves carefully choreographed, but executed blind. Cinematographer Charles Lang had a radical idea. What if they shot at light levels so low that the film stock could barely register an image? Experimented with exposure, pushing the film to its technical limits, creating frames where faces dissolve into shadow, where the viewer has to strain to see what's happening. Warner Brothers executives hated the footage initially, insisting audiences wouldn't tolerate such darkness. Lang convinced them that was precisely the point. The discomfort was intentional, but this meant Hepburn and Arkin rehearsed and performed the fight scene in almost total blackness. They worked out every movement, every grab and fall, until muscle memory took over. During one take, Arkin accidentally struck Hepburn across the face in the darkness, splitting her lip. They continued filming. The bruise is visible in certain shots, a real injury that the makeup department had to incorporate. The scene took 6 days to shoot. Hepburn worked 14-hour days in darkness, her nerves frayed to breaking. The contact lenses she wore to simulate blindness caused persistent eye infections. She pushed through. There's a moment near the end where Susie, having broken all the lights, has the advantage for the first time. She knows the apartment in darkness. Rote is now the one stumbling blind. Hepburn's face in that moment, half visible in the faint light from the refrigerator, shows something beyond acting. It's triumph mixed with exhaustion, a woman who has been through actual hell and emerged. You're not watching Audrey Hepburn anymore. You're watching Susie Hendricks. Or maybe you're watching something in between, a performer who has merged completely with her character's ordeal. The question becomes, when does dedication cross into damage? The details hidden in shadow. Most fans remember Wait Until Dark for its famous jump scare. We'll get there. The film is filled with micro details that transform everything when you notice them. These aren't Easter eggs planted for obsessive. They're storytelling choices that reveal how deeply the filmmakers understood suspense. Watch Susie's hands throughout the film. In early scenes, before the criminals arrive, her movements are careful but confident. She's learned her apartment, mapped its dimensions, pours coffee by placing her finger inside the cup, feeling for the rising liquid. She measures sugar by counting scoops. These are real techniques taught to the newly blind, rendered with documentary precision. But as the film progresses and Susie realizes she's in danger, her movements change. Her hands become frantic, grasping. When she's trying to find the doll hidden in the basement, her fingers claw at surfaces, increasingly desperate. Hepburn modulates this brilliantly. It's not just fear, but the specific terror of someone whose primary sense is touch, who is suddenly surrounded by potential threats she can only discover by reaching into the unknown. Now notice the sound design. Wait Until Dark is a surprisingly quiet film for a thriller. There's no omnipresent score telegraphing danger. Instead, sound designer James Moody and composer Henry Mancini made silence the dominant texture, punctuated by specific noises that carry meaning. The click of a door, the scrape of a chair, the creak of a floorboard. Every sound becomes a vector of information for Susie, and for us. We're trained to listen as she listens, to map the apartment through audio cues. There's a sequence where Susie believes she's alone, moving through her apartment in what she thinks is safety. Camera reveals Roth watching her from the bedroom, silent and still. For nearly a full minute, we watch her move past him, oblivious, while he stands frozen. No music, just her footsteps and breathing. It's almost unbearable, that gap between what she knows and what we know. And here's the detail that changes everything. Watch the light sources. Jenkins and Lang use practicals, lamps, the refrigerator light, street lamps through windows, to create pockets of illumination that Susie can't perceive. But we can. The film becomes a study in sight versus blindness, advantage versus vulnerability. When Susie finally destroys all the light sources, equalizing the playing field, the visual strategy inverts. Now darkness is safety. Sight becomes a liability. It didn't shout. It endured in the details. 7. Battle over the scare. Now we come to the moment everyone remembers, the jump scare that supposedly made audiences scream in 1967 and still works today. That moment almost never happened, at least not the way we know it. In the original stage play, the ending is somewhat ambiguous. Rote appears to be dead, stabbed by Susie in the dark fight. Lights come up. Safety seems assured. Then suddenly, he's not quite dead, lunging one final time in a desperate grab before finally succumbing. Terrence Young understood this couldn't just be a generic shock. He needed something that would violate every rule the film had established, that would punish the audience for thinking they were safe. He and Alan Arkin devised the moment carefully. Complete silence after Roth's apparent death. A long pause where we think it's over. Then an explosive lunge from the shadows, accompanied by a sudden blast of sound. A Warner Brothers executive, unnamed in production records, though crew members later identified him, watched the rough cut and insisted the moment was too much. His argument: audiences would be upset at being manipulated so blatantly. The film had been sophisticated, elegant. This felt cheap, like a carnival. Trick? Young fought back. He argued that the entire film had been building to this precise violation of trust, that the audience needed to experience Susie's vulnerability one final time before her ultimate survival. More than that, the shock was philosophically consistent with the film's themes. Life doesn't end cleanly. Predators don't die on cue. Safety is always provisional. The studio gave Young 2 weeks to test both versions in previews, one with the shock, one without. The version without the final scare played as competent but forgettable. The version with the shock generated visceral reactions. Screams, gasps, one report of a woman fainting. The studio relented. That final lunge, Roth's hand shooting into frame as he makes one last grab for Susie, was captured in a single take on the last day of principal photography, October 12, 1967. Arkin hit his mark perfectly, launching himself from complete stillness into explosive violence. The irony no one saw coming? That cheap trick, the executive feared, would become one of the most referenced moments in suspense cinema, a template for jump scares that filmmakers still study. What seemed like manipulation was actually truth. Evil doesn't die conveniently. Fate. When prey became predator. The deepest irony in Wait Until Dark is structural, embedded in the film's DNA. It begins as a story about a disabled woman as victim, vulnerable, and helpless before predatory men. Susie is positioned as prey. Her blindness is framed initially as pure disadvantage. The criminals assume she'll be easy to manipulate, to frighten into submission. Then the film inverts everything. Susie's blindness becomes her weapon. By destroying the light sources, she transforms her apartment into a space where she has the advantage, where Roth stumbles while she moves with confidence. The hunted becomes the hunter. The prey becomes the predator. This wasn't just a clever plot twist, it was quietly revolutionary for 1967, a year when disability in film almost always meant helplessness or sainthood. Susie Hendricks is neither. She's scared, yes, but she's also resourceful, intelligent, furious. She fights, she strategizes, she wins. Hepburn understood what this meant. In interviews after the film's release, she talked about wanting to play women who weren't just beautiful or charming, but capable, who could save themselves. Susie represented something she hadn't been allowed to play before, a woman who loses every advantage except her will to survive, and discovers that's enough. Here's the bitter truth beneath that empowerment narrative. Hepburn herself felt increasingly powerless in Hollywood during this period. Her marriage was ending. Her box office value was being questioned. The industry she'd conquered in the 1950s now seemed ready to discard her for younger faces. Susie's transformation from victim to victor became, in some ways, a rehearsal for her own fight to remain relevant, to prove she was more than the porcelain image the industry had constructed. Life was mirroring art in ways that made the performance almost uncomfortably raw. When Susie screams, "You're trying to frighten me," half accusation, half revelation, you can hear something beyond the script, a performer confronting her own fears through her characters. Nye. The critics, the crowd, and the contradiction. Wait Until Dark premiered on October 26, 1967, at New York's Music Hall Theater. Initial critical reaction was mixed, almost dismissive. The New York Times called it efficiently contrived, but suggested Hepburn was wasted on mere thriller mechanics. Several critics argued the film was stage-bound, claustrophobic in ways that felt like limitations rather than choices. The audience disagreed violently. Wait Until Dark became a sleeper hit. eventually grossing over $17 million against its $2 million budget. Word spread about the jump scare, about Hepburn's raw performance, about the dark fight that left viewers genuinely shaken. Lines formed around theaters. People went back for repeat viewings, often bringing friends who needed to experience the shock themselves. Hepburn received her 5th Academy Award nomination for Best Actress, the only Oscar nomination the film earned. She didn't win. Katharine Hepburn took the prize for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. But the nomination itself represented recognition that Audrey Hepburn had done something genuinely surprising, that she'd broken free from her established persona and delivered something darker, more visceral. The contradiction? Critics and awards bodies treated Wait Until Dark as a minor work, a genre exercise elevated by star power. But audiences understood what reviewers missed. This was Hepburn's most psychologically exposed performance, a high-wire act that required her to access real terror and play it with absolute commitment. The fact that it existed within a thriller framework didn't diminish the achievement. If anything, the genre constraints made the rawness more powerful. Over time, critical opinion shifted. Wait Until Dark is now recognized as one of the essential psychological thrillers, a film that understood how to weaponize cinematic language in service of suspense. Film schools teach its lighting technique. Horror directors cite its influence. What seemed like a modest thriller in 1967 now looks like a masterclass. Recognition came too late to save Hepburn's momentum. She would make only 5 more films over the next 20 years, retreating increasingly from Hollywood into humanitarian work. Wait Until Dark represented both a creative triumph and, in some ways, a goodbye. Proof that she could evolve beyond her image, deliver just as the industry was moving on without her. The template. Others followed. Wait Until Dark's influence on cinema ripples outward in ways both obvious and subtle. The most direct inheritors are home invasion thrillers, Panic Room, Don't Breathe, Hush, The Collector. These films borrow Wait Until Dark's basic geometry, a confined space, an isolated protagonist, predators who think they have the advantage until the space itself becomes a weapon. But the deeper influence is in how disability is depicted. Before Wait Until Dark, blindness in film typically signified either saintly innocence or total helplessness. After, filmmakers had a template for showing disabled characters as capable, strategic, even dangerous. Don't Breathe inverts the dynamic entirely. The blind character is the predator. But the premise only works because Wait Until Dark established that blindness could be an advantage in darkness. Film also influenced how suspense is photographed. Charles Lang's decision to push the film stock to its limits, to embrace darkness rather than fight it, gave cinematographers permission to let their images dissolve into shadow. Watch the visual language of films like Alien, The Silence of the Lambs, Zodiac. They all trust darkness in ways that trace back to Wait Until Dark's radical commitment to making the audience see, or fail to see, as the protagonist does. Henry Mancini's score deserves mention here. Mancini, known for sophisticated jazz compositions, delivered something much sparer for Wait Until Dark, long stretches of silence punctuated by sharp musical stings. This restraint, the understanding that suspense often requires the absence of score, became influential. John Carpenter, master of minimalist horror music, cited Wait Until Dark as a revelation in how silence could be scored. Even the jump scare template, now overused to the point of parody, traces its modern DNA to Roth's final lunge. The formula: establish apparent safety, create silence, violate both with sudden violence. It's been mimicked thousands of times, but rarely with Wait Until Dark's commitment to making the shock narratively meaningful rather than gratuitous. More subtly, the film influenced performance. Hepburn's willingness to abandon her image, to get dirty and desperate and unglamorous, gave other stars permission to take similar risks. Sigourney Weaver in Alien, Jodie Foster in The Silence of the Lambs, Charlize Theron in Monster. All of them play women who survive by refusing to perform conventional femininity in moments of crisis. Hepburn showed that path first. Why we're still afraid. Here's what. Wait Until Dark understands that most thrillers miss. Suspense isn't about the monster in the darkness. It's about the geometry of safety collapsing, about discovering that the walls you thought protected you are actually cages, that the advantages you assumed, sight, mobility, strength, can be neutralized by someone who understands the architecture better than you do. See, Hendrix's journey resonates because it literalizes a universal fear. What if I'm not safe in my own home? What if the tools I rely on, my senses, my knowledge of my space, become useless? What if I'm truly alone when the predator arrives? These aren't abstract anxieties. They're primal, hardwired into our nervous systems. But the film endures because it doesn't stop at fear. Susie's transformation from victim to victor, her decision to destroy the lights and reclaim her apartment as her territory, her refusal to submit, even when submission seems like the only option. This is where Wait Until Dark transcends genre and becomes something more mythic. It's a story about how we find agency in the spaces where we thought we had none, how vulnerability can become strategy if we're willing to reimagine the rules. Watching Wait Until Dark today, knowing what we now know about its production, Hepburn's genuine claustrophobia, the real injuries sustained in darkness, the studio's near destruction of the film's most iconic moment, adds another layer. You're watching artists work at the absolute edge of their comfort, risking real psychological and physical damage in pursuit of authentic terror. That commitment bleeds through every frame. The fear isn't simulated. The desperation isn't performed. Something genuine was captured, even if the cost was higher than anyone planned. And maybe that's why the film still works. In an era of CGI safety and stunt doubles, Wait Until Dark reminds us what cinema was before every risk could be mitigated, when actors actually had to inhabit danger, when suspense meant pushing everyone involved, performers and audience, into genuine discomfort. It's a document of a kind of filmmaking we don't do anymore, a relic from when movies could actually hurt. The choice that changed everything wasn't a single decision. It was Hepburn's willingness to shatter her image, Young's commitment to radical darkness, Lang's refusal to light properly, Arkin's physical intensity, and a studio's reluctant trust that audiences could handle being genuinely frightened. Together, these choices created something that transcends its modest ambitions and becomes simply one of the best thrillers ever made. See it again in the dark. So here's what I want you to do. Watch Wait Until Dark again, but this time pay attention to what's hidden in plain sight. Notice Hepburn's hands mapping her world. Listen to how silence becomes its own kind of sound. Watch how light sources create islands of safety that Susie can't perceive. And when you get to that final jump scare, the one that nearly didn't happen, remember that you're watching a moment that almost died in the editing room, saved only because test audiences couldn't stop screaming. Think about what it cost Hepburn to deliver that performance. The weeks spent in darkness and claustrophobia, the injuries and infections and panic attacks that became the texture of her terror. Think about the fact that what you're seeing isn't just acting. It's a document of someone pushing herself to the absolute limit of psychological and physical endurance. And then ask yourself, would we make this film today? Would we ask a performer to actually experience what their character experiences? Have we lost something in our modern safety, our digital distance from real risk? I think Wait Until Dark endures precisely because it captured something we can't replicate. A moment when cinema required everyone involved to step into actual danger, when the line between performance and reality dissolved in the darkness, when fear stopped being simulated and became, for everyone in that apartment set, uncomfortably real. Watch it again with fresh eyes. Or maybe, more appropriately, watch it again in the dark. That's where its secrets live. If you've seen Wait Until Dark, what moment still makes you hold your breath? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this changed how you see the film, if these hidden layers made you appreciate the craft and courage behind what looks like a simple thriller, hit that like button. Sometimes the deepest truths are hidden in plain sight, waiting in the dark for someone to finally see them.